probably a very familiar passage to all of you. So as I was preparing this sermon, I was reminded of a joke. I believe it's an old Jewish joke. But so there was a man who had a special event coming up. Maybe it was a wedding, and he decided he needed a new pair of pants for this wedding. And so he went to his local tailor and he said, "Hey, I need a new pair of pants. Can you please make me a pair of pants that's, uniquely fitted to me and will look really good? I'm so sorry it's such short notice, but I procrastinated and I really need these pants by tomorrow. Can you make them for me?" And his tailor says, "Well, yeah, of course. I wouldn't be a very good tailor if I can't make a simple pair of pants in one day." And so he agrees to the job. And then he's maybe a little bit busy, and it just kind of slips his mind. And he doesn't end up making the pants. And then 6 months later, he goes back and he says, "Oh my goodness, I completely forgot to make these pants for my friend." And so 6 months later, he really quickly throws together a pair of pants, on the measurements that he took. And he goes and takes them to his friend and he says, I'm so sorry. I totally flaked out. I know I was supposed to make these pants for you 6 months ago, but here they are, like I promised. Here are the pants. And he tries them on, and yeah, they fit perfectly. They're not too long. They're not too short. Everything is handmade, perfect for him. And, they're maybe the best pair of pants that he's ever owned. They're really, really perfect. But then he turns to his tailor friend and he says, "You've really got some nerve. I asked for these pants 6 months ago. The whole world was made in 6 days, and you can't make a pair of pants in one day. It takes you 6 months. And his tailor friend says, "Yeah, but look at the world and look at these pants." All humor aside, Genesis 1 is a hot button text. It's full of controversy for a lot of people. Virtually every scientist, every academic holds to the Big Bang Theory, biological evolution, although that's losing a little bit of traction these days, and Christians who contend that God has revealed himself clearly and authoritatively as a mighty creator out of nothing. Christians in academic circles who hold to that are viewed as backwards or unintelligent or brainwashed. And they'll say, look at these Christians from the very start, the very beginning of their holy book. They've got it all wrong. So, why would I want anything to do with that system of thinking? And then they'll say, like the guy in the joke, look at the world. It's so broken. There's war. There's poverty everywhere. There's disease. How could you possibly look at this world that we live in and think that an all-powerful, all-good being made this? And so they reject it. They say, no, we're not going to believe in that God. It doesn't match up. And yet, we still want some kind of an explanation, right? If you reject the Christian explanation for how we got here, you're still looking for some different explanation to fill that void. You're just rejecting this one, but they would never reject the hunt for some explanation in general. And so we have to ask, what does the Bible have to say for itself on this count? And I think we need to back up a little bit, and we need to ask ourselves first, what is Genesis 1 in the first place? See, science is really, really good at answering how questions. But when you start to ask scientists the more difficult why questions, science all of a sudden is really, really bad. It doesn't have a lot of answers. Scientists can explain to you in very great detail what happens inside a particle accelerator like the one at CERN that they built in Europe and that discovered a bunch of new particles just recently, and they can tell you all of the math, and we can break it down in great detail, and we can predict what's going to happen when we bash two protons together, and we can give you all of these charts and statistics and probabilities, and we can go even into quantum mechanics, and they can tell you how all of this works. And then you can go further than that. You can point to how all of these atoms and molecules build up, and how they're connected in your body in such a way, and how they interact. And then you can go to a larger scale. We can talk about how the human cell functions when you're taking in food, and metabolism, and you can get into biology and all of these different things. And we can go on and on and on, right? Course after course, textbook after textbook on how things work. But on a more fundamental level, that most basic of questions that every 2-year-old is so good at asking, why? There's an unsatisfying silence, isn't there? And so when we approach the Bible, we need to take a step back, and we need to ask, what is it that we're reading first of all? Just like Jeopardy, we're given the answer, and we've got to find out what the question is to make sense of it. Is Genesis asking a how question, or is it asking a why question? And when we do step back, we quickly realize that all of the complaints that reject this chapter as falsehood are themselves false, pointless complaints, because they're assuming that Genesis is asking the wrong question. This chapter, Genesis 1, was never meant to answer scientific questions of how. It's not about how the world was created primarily. And when you try to force it to be a science textbook, of course, it's going to look ridiculous. But it's there. This chapter is here for us to answer the one question that science never can, the why. Of why are we here? Why is the world the way that it is? And when you let it do that, suddenly it begins to make much more sense. Now, I'm not telling you this to tell you that you can have your cake and eat it too. I'm not saying this to say that, well, science does one thing and faith does another, and you can kind of just drive a wedge between them, and they're completely non-overlapping domains. I don't want you to take either of those to be the point that I'm trying to make. I'm not here to tell you that you can be a Bible-believing Christian and also believe in evolution. I think that there are a lot of other problems with that view besides the ones that come up in Genesis 1. But it's simply to say that how we approach passages of the Bible shapes what we get out of them. What we expect them to be is going to determine how we interpret what we get out of it. And many well-meaning Christians throughout the ages, I think, have drastically misunderstood what Genesis 1 is trying to teach and what it's all about. See, this chapter is here. God is taking something incomprehensible, like the absolute, utter beginning of everything. You can't wrap your mind around that. You can't really understand that, right? Even, all of these scientists with the Big Bang theory will admit that at the very, very first moment of creation, when the Big Bang supposedly actually happened, at that very first moment, we can only go back so far with our math. Our models can only go back to within what's called 1 Planck instant after the Big Bang. That's the smallest unit of time that's possible in quantum mechanics. And you can't get behind that time 1. You can't get back to time 0 with our physics and our math. It's just something that we are never able to look beyond. It's a horizon that we can't see past. And there is the possibility then that the models that we have are just not very good at looking at a lot of things that are off the map, so to speak. Right? Once you get off the edge of the map, it's really hard to tell what happens. Yeah, things might continue the way that we expect. We might be able to extrapolate. But sometimes when you get really close to the edge of something, sometimes it does something really unexpected, and all of your kind of drawing out that straight line doesn't do what we expected. I'll give you just one quick example. This is what engineers like Chris will know as Hooke's law. It's a graph of strain and stress, and basically it says, how far can I stretch or bend a piece of steel or some other material before it snaps? And, at what point will it, if you take like a ruler and you bend it a little bit, it goes back into its shape. It's elastic, right? That would be this side of the graph. And then all of a sudden you bend it far enough and it's either going to stay bent or it's going to snap, it's going to break. And so if you only knew this part of the graph, this is a nice curve. And so you might assume that it's going to continue and it's going to just kind of keep doing this all the way along. If you only had this data, that would be a logical conclusion. And yet you can see that this side of the graph is very, very different. If you were trying to guess what happens over here, but you couldn't see it, you would guess probably very, very wrong. And so that is exactly what is happening when science tries to take what we can know and push it back past that horizon into the unknowable, when it tries to interpret things that are just completely out of anything that we've ever experienced and off the map in that sense. So Genesis is here to take this unsearchable mystery, this black box of the beginning, what things were like before there was even such a thing as time, all of this incomprehensibility, and it's trying to make sense of that for limited, finite human minds. This chapter is God himself, through Moses, interpreting to us what he's done and why, so that we can understand ourselves and him. And if you think about it, it's really the why questions that are much more important anyway, isn't it? Have you ever watched an artisan or a craftsman at work? Maybe you've seen time-lapse videos on YouTube, right? When you're watching an artist at work, you don't care about the thickness of the paint. You don't care what material the brush is made out of. You don't care about, graphing the progressive moisture content of paint as it dries. You don't care about any of that. You care about the relation of the parts of the painting artistically. You care about the interplay of color and light. You care about the finished product. You care about what it represents. What is this art about? How does it reflect the skill of the artist? Ultimately, what you want is to appreciate it on your wall. The how questions really don't matter nearly as much as the why, or nearly as much as simply enjoying what has been created. And we get a little bit of a clue that this is actually what the goal of Genesis 1 is about, based on the genre of, what genre does Genesis 1 fall into? And if you think about that, it really doesn't read like a scientific essay. Actually, the Bible is full of these kind of duplicates where it'll describe the same event two different ways. One will be in prose, just kind of like you would read in a novel or any kind of narrative, and the other will be in poetry. And you see these kind of doublets all throughout the Bible. Just to give you two examples, we have Judges 4 and 5 tells us the same event in two ways. Judges 4 tells us how the judge Deborah and the general Barak defeated Sisera, but actually it was this woman named Jael. And Judges 4, you'll read very straightforwardly, behold, as Barak was pursuing Sisera, Jael went out to meet him, and said to him, "Come now, I will show you the man you're seeking." So they went into her tent, and there lay Sisera dead with the tent peg in his temple. This woman defeats the enemy of Israel. Very straightforward. Then you have the same exact event narrated again in the next chapter, but it's in poetry. And so you have from heaven, the stars fought. From their courses, they fought against Sisera. The torrent Kishon swept them away. The ancient torrent, the torrent Kishon, march on my soul with might. It's talking about the same exact event, but it's presenting it in a very symbolic, very poetic way. Same thing in the book of Exodus with the crossing of the Red Sea. Straightforward prose narrative in chapter 14. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. The Lord drove the sea back by a strong east wind all night, and made the sea dry land, and the waters were divided. And the people of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, the waters being a wall to them on their right hand and on their left. And then in the next chapter, 15, you have Miriam singing about this, or writing poetry about this very same event, and she describes it, again, symbolically, poetically. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The floods stood up in a heap, and the deep congealed in the heart of the sea. Which one is more true? Which one is more accurate scientifically? Did the waters really congeal and become like a gel? Did they freeze? Was it ice? Was it really the blast of the Lord's nostrils, or was it a strong east wind? Which one is more true? Well, they're both telling you the same story in different ways. One is prose and one is poetry. And so figuring out what genre Genesis 1 fits into is going to really tell us a lot about how we should interpret it. Is it prose or is it poetry? See, it's not intended to be a technical scientific explanation. It's poetry. It's symbolic. You know, you can read a history book about the 100 Years' War, and then go and next to that read the prologue to Shakespeare's Henry V. Totally different. See, the poetry expresses a concreteness, a situatedness, a nuance, or a difference of emphasis, a personality that even the most detailed and well-crafted historical prose can't approach. It's for that reason that if you've ever read Tolkien's Silmarillion, the creation myth that he writes for the world of Middle-earth is actually the angels of Middle-earth literally sing the world into existence in the Silmarillion. Why? Because music is ordered. There's harmony, there's melody, there's rhythm, and all of that is symbolic and poetic description of the order and harmony and melody and rhythm that you find in the created world. So think about poetry, think about song. Look at the repeated melodic phrases in this chapter. Look at the things that are repeated over and over and over again that are telling you this is a poem, this is a song. God said, and there was, that pattern over and over again. It was good at the end of every day. There was evening and there was morning. There was evening and there was morning. There was evening and there was morning. When you read it like a poem, which it is, all of a sudden it becomes much clearer, and the big picture starts to come out as well. All of a sudden, you begin to see that day 4 through 6 actually look a lot like a retelling or a recap of days 1 through 3. That it's focusing back in on that same creation chunk and giving you a different angle on it. Recapping rather than contradicting, maybe fleshing out. So you have days 1 through 3, and then days 4 through 6 flesh out those same kind of areas. The same way that an artist will first sketch an outline of what he's going to draw and then return over the same areas, filling in more detail and color. And you can see this pattern all throughout. Right? Day 1 through 3, you can see the parallelism there. First, God creates these different areas or kingdoms of creation, the kingdom of light. And then on day 4, he fills it with the luminaries, the sun, moon, and stars, to fill it and, as the verses say, rule over it as creature kings. On the second day, he divides the sky from the seas, and then on the fifth day, he fills the sky with winged creatures and the seas with sea creatures to fill the creation that he's made and also to rule over it. And then on day 3, dry land and plants coming up. And then on day 6, land animals to fill the land and man to rule over, tilling the ground and growing things. And so you begin to see these parallels and the poetic symmetry. And then finally on day 7, you have the great high king resting from his work, and you have Sabbath. The creation kingdoms, the creature king, the creator king who then rests and exercises dominion over everything that he has made. This chapter is here to give us a snapshot of what this heavenly work week was like, and then the finished results of God's perfect masterpiece as he sits down to take pleasure forever in what he's made. And because it's poetry, you can't push the details too far. It's poetic. This is the story of God exerting his almighty spiritual power to carefully create and fill his masterpiece creation, and then to rule over it through his creature kings with a little k, and to enjoy it himself as the great high king. That's what Genesis 1 is. But now we have to ask, if that's what it is, then what does it teach? If it's not about the question how, but rather why, then what is the answer to that why question that we're presented with? See, it's not meant to satisfy our pedantic or academic curiosity, but it's here to make big, sweeping statements about who God is so that we can know him and so that we can know ourselves in right relation to him. So what does it teach? Well, first of all, it teaches that God created. Only God can create out of nothing. This word there, created, it's not rearranging stuff that already exists, but it's inventing out of non-existence. There's actually 2 words used in this chapter. The first one that's translated as created is always the Hebrew word bara, and throughout the Bible, only God can bara. And then also there's another word, to do or make. God also can do or make, which is the Hebrew word asa. But humans can also asa in a way that they cannot bara. And so when it says God created, that's inventing out of nothing. I can asa if I'm creative enough, but I'm always using something that God has already created, right? I'm just rearranging it. No matter what painting you paint, try and draw a picture. You're always going to be taking elements of things that you've seen before. You're never going to be able to invent something entirely new. You're using a fixed set of colors and shapes and artistic devices. You can't invent a new color in a way that God could. No matter what you do, you are always arranging things that have been made before by God. You can never really make anything new, but only God can bara, create out of nothing. It's God's direct action. It's not evolution. It's not spiritual Play-Doh that he's just kind of shaping some formless primordial ooze that was already there before he came along. There was no such thing as space, time, or matter. And into that nothingness that we can't even understand, God spoke and it was. And you see that pattern again and again. It's the divine fiat command and then cosmic obedience. God simply says, let there be, and out of nothingness, being springs. It's a display of his character and his glory. Not only that, we see that it's personal and precious, this creation. Verse 1 tells us that the Spirit hovers, and that image there of the Spirit of God hovering over the waters is an image of a mother bird hovering over its nest. There's an investedness, a care, a preciousness, a watchfulness in this hovering. Galatians 4:19 tells us that Paul has these pains of childbirth until Christ is formed in you. That's the kind of sense that I get of the Spirit hovering over the water, forming this earth, being careful about it, watching over it, making sure that everything is exactly right. He's pouring into it his own beauty, his own goodness. He's watching to see his own personality reflected into this world that he's creating, especially human beings, and then he fills it with his infinite wisdom. Right? Last week we quoted from Proverbs 8, wisdom. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his work. And so the creation itself reflects the wisdom and perfection and character of God as he hovers over it and pours himself into it. We also see in this chapter the raw, divine power of God in speaking, because it's through the word that God creates everything. Everything that God creates in Genesis chapter 1, he does so through his word, through speaking. God said, "Let there be light." God said, "Let there be a division. Let there be living creatures." Every single time God speaks, God's word has power in itself. He simply speaks, and it is. That phrase is repeated over and over again. And yet we see in John 1, it tells us that the Word of God is Jesus. And so when Genesis 1 tells us that God created everything that there is through his Word, it's also telling us that God created everything through Jesus Christ, his Son. That Jesus is also active in creation. And so in Genesis 1, you have poetically all three members of the Trinity there functioning. You have the Father, the Spirit hovering over the waters, and the Word, all involved in creation. And that is fundamental to the why, because you get down to verse 26 and you find something that you probably didn't expect, because God refers to himself as a we. There's a plural there. Let us create man in our own image and after our likeness. What's going on here? That means that God did not create because he had any unmet need. Before the creation, there's already a we in the Trinity. There's already a diversity. In other words, God is not lonely in eternity past. There's no need to create. He would still be God, forever blessed, if he had never created a single thing. There's no power tripping here where he's in need of creatures to be his minions and his underlings and to serve him, because God is not served by human hands. The Trinity has always existed in perfect, infinite love for one another for eternity past. And so what you get then is that creation is the expansion of that divine love. It's a widening of the circle. It's creating more objects. Did I skip a verse there? Go back. One more. It's creating more objects to share in that love, to love and be loved. God creates us in order to give himself to us. He creates because we need him, not because he needs us. John 17 tells us the same thing. Jesus is praying for his disciples, and he shows how he shares this love with them. I'm sorry, I guess that verse is not there, but it says, "Father, I have loved them with the love that you loved me before the creation of the world." God shares the internal, eternal, infinite love within the Trinity with you in creation. And so in creation, as a creature of God, the love with which the Father loves the Son, with which the Son loves the Father, and the Father loves the Spirit, and the Spirit loves the Son, that love is shared with you as his creatures. Furthermore, it tells us that creation was good. That means that it matters, that it's important, that it was at the first unbroken, that it was perfect and glorious, just as God is. That means that we don't need to avoid the material world in order to be pure or holy. We don't need to treat pleasure as though it was something evil to be avoided. There is goodness in creation. God made it. And as 1 Timothy 4, it tells us it's there to be received with thanksgiving. It also reminds us that all of the brokenness and evil in this world that people so often use as evidence against God was not there originally. It was introduced later on. It's our fault. It's not faulty craftsmanship. It's not as though someone goofed up on the inspection and gave us this broken world that God was careless with. No, God said that it was very good in the beginning. So what does all of this mean for us? What's the so what? Okay, the world is good. God created it through his power. What does that all mean for me? So what? First, it means that this world has a meaning. We're not just along for the ride, creating our own meaning, as the New Agers or the existentialists like to say. This is the meaning of life in this chapter. It's the meaning of all existence, to know God. People say, I don't see it. Or as the philosopher Bertrand Russell famously said, not enough evidence, God, not enough evidence. Well, Genesis 1 begs to differ because this is the whole point. If people are saying not enough evidence, then we know that there must be something wrong with their eyes, as the Bible does indeed tell us. Because knowing and experiencing this God who created the whole universe is the whole point. Everything that exists for us to know God personally. It's to enter into the glory and love of God, to participate in that eternal community. Creation is not just an end in and of itself or for its own sake or just because, but it has a goal of people, God's creatures, being an integral part of God's glorious rest and enjoying with him all the goodness that he's made. That's why this world, in spite of all the ways that we messed it up, and we'll talk about that later as we continue through Genesis, that's why it's still so perfectly suited for us. Because it points to and reveals our great God who wants to be known and the work that he's done in order for us to share in his rest. It means that we're not accidental or by chance or the haphazard result of a bunch of random mathematical functions. There's nothing that exists which was not put here intentionally to display God's dominion, God's control, and God's infinite love. And you might say, well, I don't really feel subjectively, I don't feel that love most of the time. I certainly don't feel like it's infinite. Perhaps, but at least then you feel the absence of it. And you know that it's supposed to be there. You feel the burning hole, that separation from the God who has made you for himself has caused. And the whole rest of the Bible, the whole storyline all the way to the end of the book of Revelation is about the derailing and then the restoring of that one cosmic goal, the redemption and restoration of creation to fellowship with God as the Creator. The gospel, all of world history, is about God accomplishing that end, sharing his love and glory and favor with his creatures in spite of our rebellion. This last part, I'm very much indebted to Tim Keller. I made the mistake of listening to his sermon on this passage, so it was stuck in my head, but it's really good stuff. So I'm paraphrasing him a little bit. But the gospel tells us, if you believe that God is who he says he is in the Word, if you take him at his word, then you know that he has made you, knit you together personally for himself. And then you also can know, you can know that you know that you know that you know that no matter what, he unchangeably loves you personally. Think about the gravity of that statement. God loves you. He knows everything about you, all of the messed up brokenness. And he says in his word, I love you. This God who speaks, and suddenly time and space and physics and light and matter and order and beauty and music and love and poetry and symmetry and vision and shapes and sounds and noses and dogs and cool water and soft earth and everything else exist out of nothing, loves you. How do you know that? Because the very same Word who made all of that stuff was later on himself made man. John 1 tells us that 2,000 years ago, the unchanging one became something that he was not before when he took upon himself a true human nature and he lived your God-delighting life for you. And he died your God-hating death for you. And on the cross, the Maker was unmade to remake you as you should have been. On the cross, the one who spoke all things into existence cried out and nothing happened. His words were powerless. The God who filled this universe with everything that lives was himself emptied. The one who breathed life into everything breathed his last. He gave up his spirit so that his spirit, that same hovering, doting, caring, parental person, exercising such care over creation, could come and fellowship and live with you forever, nearer than you are to your own self. That is what this world is about. That is why we're here. That's the story of the whole Bible, the whole universe, your whole life. That is why. Believe it. Find your purpose and your destiny in that story. Enter into the love of God through faith in Christ, and he will call you good. Just as he did at the very beginning. He'll say to you, this is how I made you. You're flawless, you're wonderful, you're full of beauty. I enjoy and delight in you like I enjoy and delight in my Son. You're my masterpiece, my handiwork. That's exactly what Ephesians 2:10 tells us. We are God's workmanship, or the Greek word there is poema. We are his poem. We are part of his song in Christ.